Have there been saints in your life through whom God has blessed you, encouraged you in your Christian life, and who can be examples to you as you live this Christian life? That's what we're talking about today on Kairos with Pastor Fraser Pierce. Fraser, good to have you back. You were preaching recently on All Saints' Day, and we had one of the traditional readings for All Saints, which is the Beatitudes from Matthew chapter 5. And you encouraged the congregation here to think locally about examples of people in their own life that come to mind when you hear the Beatitudes. So let's talk a bit about that today. But perhaps we can just go back a step first and talk about the fact that we were celebrating All Saints' Day and why we would do this and how it works in our Lutheran tradition as well.
Yeah, right. So back on All Saints' Day, in fact, I quoted from the Augsburg Confession, this confession of faith, which is the most important confession of faith peculiar to the Lutheran Church on this very topic, right? And I'll read it now, a very short quote from the Augsburg Confession. This is Article 21. Our churches teach that the history of the saints may be set before us so that we may follow their faith and good works according to our calling. So it's a good idea to recount the history of the saints, to talk about them, what they've done, and for their example of faith to be an encouragement to us in our life of faith. And in fact, in the Augsburg Confession, it names David as a great example of a king. This is an example for Charles V, who was the emperor at the time, right? Charles, have a look at David. What did he do? He wasn't perfect, but look how God used him, this sort of thing. You know, in the Lutheran Church, it's quite traditional or normal to have churches named in honour of saints, to have saints' days celebrated so that we give thanks to God for these people of faith who've been a good example to us. But you're right, on this particular day, as I proclaim God's word from the Beatitudes, I encourage people indeed to think locally, you know, to think about people in their own lives who have been good examples of faithful Christian living.
Yeah, so I mean, many of our churches are named St. Paul or St. Peter, and we tend to think of the famous people in Christian history or in the world today who might be high-profile Christians, but it was for me a bit of a helpful shift to think, okay, what about more local, as you put it, lower-profile saints, holy people in our own lives. And so where do we go from there then?
Well, I looked at the Beatitudes, and I took it as being mainly about other people. So
it's interesting the way the Beatitudes are actually, the words that are actually used, the grammar there, and the person it's in.
So, for example, they start, you know, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Right?
They could have said, blessed are you.
Yes, and you might have even expected that, because it starts, you know, Jesus sees the crowd, he goes up the mountain, he sits down, his disciples come to him, and he begins to teach them, saying. So you might think the very first thing he's going to say will be a second person plural, blessed are you, right? And indeed, later in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus does talk this way, right? You know, you are the light of the world, you are the salt of the earth, this sort of stuff, right? So it's not as if that's not part of the great Sermon on the Mount. It just doesn't seem to start that way.
There's something about the grammar and syntax that seems to get you thinking about other people, in the first place at least, even if it's fine to take it, you know, directed to you as well.
Right, and he's telling his disciples this evidently in the presence of the crowds. Of course, at the end of the Beatitudes, he does say, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. So it does, you know, turn to the second person at that stage, but this is not how it begins. And I think this is suggestive of how we can interpret the Beatitudes.
And so you then got people to start thinking, okay, who comes to mind for you in your own life, whether they're living or whether they've died, and then you went, but you know, there's a lot of the Beatitudes, and so a bit much for a sermon. So you went into some specific ones, just a few of them, and maybe we can just touch on at least one or two of them today to give it a flavour of how this proceeded.
Yeah, so I looked at the Beatitude, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. And mercy in particular used examples from the Gospel of Matthew in this case, of mercy being primarily about helping people in need. And so blessed are those who help people in need, for they will receive mercy. For they will receive mercy from God, by the way, is the implication of these words. So you get these divine passives in Jesus' teaching. When it's not specified, he's talking about God. You know, knock and the door will be opened to you. God will open the door is the idea, right? So just getting, I encourage the congregation to think about people in their own lives who professed faith and shown mercy helped them in their need, right? It may have been things as simple as, they've invited you into their homes for dinner when you've been lonely, something as simple as that. Or you've had a young family and they've offered to babysit so you could go out, for your wedding anniversary or something as simple as that. Or you haven't been able to get to church and they've given you a lift. Or you've been in hospital and they've visited you, right? Or you've had some other trouble, personal or financial, and they've been able to give you real assistance, right? That's mercy from a scriptural point of view. And I think on All Saints' Day, it's good for us to think about the people that God has put into our lives who've professed Christ and who've shown this sort of mercy to us.
And so as you were preparing the sermon, were there particular instances coming to mind
of
for
course.
you? Without name?
Yes, I can think of many people. By the way, people, one or two I did tell after, you've been merciful to me. People who themselves are well aware of their own faults. And would never think of themselves as saints, right? And yet indeed they have been examples of Christian living and encouragement to me. This is the fact.
And these things can have such a big impact.
Right.
I was just thinking of one, just as you're talking now, I was thinking of one guy who has told me this story multiple times of how he and his wife had a new baby and they're under a lot of pressure, and someone from the church came around and they saw the washing and they went and hung it out. Didn't ask, didn't say anything about it, just hung the washing out. And it's a very small thing, and this is decades later. He still talks about what a huge impact this had.
You think about Jesus saying, if you give a glass of water. So very small acts of mercy resonate eternally in Jesus' teaching. Jesus also says, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy, because God will give them mercy. So I think we're also meant to understand that when Christian people have shown mercy to us, helped us in our need, that we can be assured God will show mercy to them, right? Jesus really does encourage us to think this way. That's great news, it seems to me, because then we can see how God's goodness and grace flows through the Christian community. I think it's also encouraging for us to think about maybe the acts of mercy that we could do that don't need to be spectacular, very simple things for the people that God's put into our lives.
And I find that's naturally the way one's mind goes with this, but it is different from saying, here's the Beatitude, think about ways you could show mercy. It's different for me having a step before that, thinking, think about the ways that God has used others to show this to you, and then you just naturally start seeing opportunities for yourself. So
you can even say further, think about how God has used these people for you, think about what God has in store for them, then think about what this might mean for you and for the wider Christian community. I think this investment side is, to my mind,
text,
that's right, it's not out of order, right? They've been wise in the way they've invested their time and energy.
What was the other beatitude? One of the other ones that
I'll do one other today. Blessed are the peacemakers. And in fact, I quoted from Luther at that point, because Luther does comment on this text. He says this, by the way, that the beatitude is, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. For God will call them his children, right? Luther says, be a reconciler and a mediator between your neighbours. Carry the best of both sides, but keep quiet about the bad, which the devil has inspired, or explain it in the best way you can. But if you must speak about an evil deed, do as Christ said. Go straight to the party and admonish. And encourage people in the congregation to think about the good examples of Christian faith that they've seen in their own lives, the people they know. How did they talk about other people? And when they faced situations of conflict, what did they do? And in particular, I encourage people to think about when they've been in conflict with their Christian brother or sister who's been an example of Christian living. How has that been? Because people who exercise faith don't badmouth them behind their back. They go straight to them and talk about it with the intention not of castigating them, but of winning them back as a brother or sister. And I think many people who have lived in the church long enough have had this experience and can give thanks to God for people who have dealt in a peacemaking way with conflict. And they can think, what, these people, God's going to call them son and daughter because that's a godly action.
Thinking about All Saints' Day, the people that God has used in our own lives, people for whom we can give thanks and be encouraged in our own lives of faith. So good to have you back, Fraser.
Good to be here.
And see you next time. Like the video and share it around, subscribe to the channel. God bless you. We'll see you next time.
God bless you.